You are seated in a dim, stone-walled room, barely wide enough to stretch your arms. It's cold. Your breath fogs the air. The only source of light is a high slit window that offers neither warmth nor cheer. Before you sits a worn wooden deskets, grooves dark with years of ink, sweat, and candle drippings. And in your hand, stiff from the chill, you hold a sharpened quill. You are not a monk, necessarily. Not all scribes in medieval Europe were bound by religious vows, though many were. What you are is a laborer of letters, a patient, uncelebrated chronicler of knowledge in a world where books are rare and words are sacred. Welcome to the world of the medieval scriptorium, the daily grind of a scribe. The word scriptorium simply means a place for writing. But that definition does little justice to the cold, quiet world these men, and sometimes women, inhabited. In monasteries and cathedral schools across Europe, the scriptorium was the engine of scholarship and memory preservation, powered not by steam or coal, but by ink, wax, discipline, and relentless endurance. The ringing of the bell matins, if you were under monastic rule. Breakfast might be a cold barley porridge, or a heel of bread soaked in last night's broth. Warmth was never guaranteed. In fact, heat was rare and often forbidden for fear it would dry out the precious parchment or warp the ink. So scribes wrapped themselves in woolen robes, hoods, and sometimes fingerless gloves, though these interfered with delicate strokes. You worked seated at a sloped writing desk, pulled a switch, angled your manuscript toward the flickering candlelight. If your monastery was rich, the desk might even have a glass window inset to magnify the letters, but most did not. Instead, you squinted, blinked, and hoped your ink didn't freeze mid-sentence. Ink, the liquid lifeblood, the ink, was no small matter. To make it, one needed oak. These were crushed, soaked in rainwater, and mixed with iron salts and gum arabic, forming a black fluid that bit into the parchment fibers. In winter, ink froze easily. In summer, it spoiled. Scribes kept it in small horn or ceramic pots, warmed between their legs or near the candle flame just enough to prevent freezing, not so much as to cause bubbling or uneven flow. If your ink thickened too much, your quill would scratch rather than glide, and the work would suffer, and the parchment. That was another ordeal entirely, the parchment problem, before the invention of paper mills in Europe. Most manuscripts were written on parchment specially prepared animal skins, usually calf, vellum, sheep, or goat. The process was long and expensive. In lime, to remove hair, stretched on a frame to dry, and scraped with a crescent-shaped knife to achieve the right thinness and smoothness. A single folio might take days to prepare. A full Bible could require the skins of over 200 animals. Each page had to be ruled with a stylus or ink guidelines to keep your writing even. Sometimes prick holes were made on the sides to mark the line's height. Mistakes weren't tolerated. While some could be scratched off with a knife, repeated errors marred the page and drew the wrath of the corrector, whose job it was to review every manuscript for accuracy. One poor scribe in a 13th century British abbey left behind a telling marginal note: "This parchment is hairy, and the ink is thin. My fingers are cold, and the day is long." We do not know his name, but his frustration echoes down the centuries. Breaks and blisters. Writing was physically grueling. Curved, the fingers cramped, the eyes blurred. Scribal tools were basic: a quill, often goose or swan, a knife to trim it, ink, and a straight edge for ruling lines. Sometimes scribes wrote with their feet wrapped in cloth, resting on warm stones if they were lucky. And chilblains were occupational hazards. And then there were the long hours. Many scribes worked from morning prayer until evening vespers. Meals were silent. Conversations were whispered or done with hand gestures, especially in strict Benedictine or Cistercian houses. Silence was not only a rule, but a necessity for concentration. In such stillness, even the scratching of quills seemed thunderous. The phrase scriptor, super libros, scribe over the books, was used not as praise, but as weary acknowledgement. Copying texts wasn't a glamorous role. It was hard labor done in obscurity, often by those too elderly or frail for few. Yet the preservation of nearly all classical and early medieval literature owes its survival to these anonymous hands. Marginal whispers, despite the austerity, scribes left behind hints of humor and humanity. Marginalia, those odd drawings or side notes scribbled in the edges of manuscripts, reveal personalities beneath the robes. Cats knocking over inkpots, knights jousting snails, doodles of faces, complaints about fleas, prayers for beer. These weren't just jokes, they were cries of fatigue and attempts to stay awake. One famous note from a 14th century Irish scribe reads, "A curse upon the cat that urinated on this manuscript last night." Another, in Latin, reads, "Let the reader not blame the scribe for the awkwardness of this letter, for the ink is bad and the day is cold." There is something hauntingly relatable about these notes. We see the hands, but we also glimpse the minds behind them. Men perhaps as bored or cold as you are now, trying to make sense of their labor in a quiet world of parchment and pain. Knowledge through drudgery, but what did they copy? Nearly everything. Bibles, psalters, commentaries, chronicles, herbals, philosophical treatises, legal codes, medical manuals, travelogues, and even poetry. For centuries, every book had to be copied by hand, and every copy was a new beginning. This meant that errors were common, but also that variations crept in, illuminated by regional idioms, local concerns, or the scribe's own theological leanings. One version of a text might praise a saint, another might ignore him altogether. Such deviations are golden trails for historians today, revealing the slow drift of belief, culture, and power across time. Still, most scribes weren't seeking glory. They weren't authors, they weren't owners. Often, they didn't even understand the Latin they were copying. They were conduits, living instruments of cultural transmission. And they did it all without electricity, ergonomic chairs, or reliable heating. So the next time you see a handwritten page in a museum or hear the rustle of parchment in an old library, remember the person whose frozen fingers shaped that inked line. What did they dream of as they worked? Did they pray for an easier life? Or did they find some strange comfort in the silence, the routine, and the steady rhythm of the quill? In the dim silence of the scriptorium, your quill scratches onward. Around you, rows of bent heads flicker in the candlelight, like hoods of crows roosting at dusk. No one speaks, no one coughs if they can help it. Only the sound of ink being applied to stretched animal skin fills the room, a slow, deliberate rhythm of devotion and repetition. But this quiet work was never done in isolation. Despite the solitude of the scribe's task, the production of a manuscript was a profoundly communal process, one bound by duty, hierarchy, and above all, a shared commitment to the transmission of knowledge. Yet that commitment came at a cost. Mistakes were punished, pages were rejected, and when the scribes were done, the hardest work often still lay ahead. The quiet order, hierarchies within the scriptorium. Life in a scriptorium was neither democratic nor particularly forgiving. The typical medieval writing room operated under a strict hierarchy, particularly in monastic settings. At the top was the armorias, the head librarian, or keeper of the books. He decided what would be copied, who would do the copying, and how materials would be used. He was also in charge of maintaining the supplies, parchment, ink, quills, and wax tablets. Below him were the scribes, ranked by skill and sometimes by seniority. The most experienced were given the most difficult or important texts, such as theological commentaries or canon law. New scribes often started with simpler task lists of abbots, inventories of property, or basic devotional prayers. Some scribes were skilled enough to add rubrics, red headings, or glosses, marginal notes. Fewer still were entrusted with illumination, the addition of gold leaf, decorative capitals, and illustrations. At the bottom of the order were the correctors, a role not of lesser skill, but of meticulous scrutiny. They combed through finished pages with knives and pumice stones, ready to scrape out the smallest mistake. If a correction could not be made without damaging the page, the entire folio might be discarded. The pressure for accuracy was immense, especially when copying sacred texts. Some monastic rules declared that scribes must fast for a day if they made a serious copying error. Others made them rewrite entire sections. One 12th century scribe from Tours reportedly wrote, "Let he who alters this book without good cause be anathema." Scribes were not above calling down curses on those who changed their work. Script and style, more than just handwriting. We might assume that handwriting was a personal choice, but that would be a modern mistake. In the medieval scriptorium, script was a deeply codified system. Different scripts reflected different regions, time periods, and functions. A trained scribe would have had to master many. Among the most prominent was Carolingian, minuscule, developed under Charlemagne's rule in the 8th and 9th centuries. It was clear, round, and widely readable, ideal for the reformation of knowledge Charlemagne promoted. Later centuries brought the more angular Gothic script, favored in universities due to its economy of space. Its compressed letters allowed scribes to fit more text onto expensive parchment, but at the cost of legibility. Reading a heavily abbreviated Gothic manuscript today is akin to deciphering a puzzle, though to the medieval student, it was simply the language of learning. A single manuscript might involve multiple styles, headings in red ink from which we get the word rubric, marked transitions. Capital letters might be left blank for later illumination. Scribes sometimes wrote cues for the artists in the margins, insert dragon here, or gold star in this space. Such coordination meant the process of creating a single book could span months or even years. A book's journey from parchment to binding. Once the pages were written, corrected, they were gathered into quires, folded groups of leaves, usually in 4s or 8s. These quires had to be ordered precisely. The wrong sequence could ruin the entire structure of a text. Page numbers were rare. Instead, scribes marked the beginning of each quire with a letter or a small symbol. The quires were then sent to the bindery, where they were sewn together using linen, thread, or gut. Covers might be made of wooden boards wrapped in leather. Richer manuscripts were adorned with metal clasps, ivory panels, or jeweled mounts. Some even had chains so they could be affixed to reading desks, an early form of library security. If a manuscript was intended for a wealthy patron or a powerful bishop, the bindings might be elaborate enough to rival the relics in the church. But most manuscripts, especially those for monastic or clerical use, were plain, practical, and built to survive handling, weather, and centuries of candle soot. The cost of a page, even in its simplest form, a single manuscript, was an investment of time, labor, and resources. The cost was staggering. Consider the raw materials. To produce a typical Bible, a monastery might need over 200 animal skins. For parchment, dozens of quills, as each one wore down after only a few pages. Gallnuts, iron salts, and gum arabic imported through fragile trade networks for ink, gold leaf, vermilion, lapis lazuli, and other minerals for illumination, many sourced from as far as Afghanistan or Spain. And then the labor. Months of writing, even more for checking, illuminating, binding, plus the training of each person involved, many of whom had spent years perfecting a particular task. A single book might cost more than a small farm. This explains why libraries were locked, chained, and guarded with curses. Books were wealth, and not just spiritual wealth. They were material investments. The non-monastic scribe worked beyond the cloister by the 13th century, especially with the rise of universities in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. A new kind of scribe emerged, the secular professional. These scribes were often literate laymen who copied legal texts, contracts, medical treatises, and university lecture notes for scholars. They worked in city workshops or out of their homes, sometimes as part of a guild. Unlike monks, they were paid. Their income depended on output, accuracy, and demand. The rise of the Petia system in university towns, where texts were loaned out in parts for students to copy, accelerated the spread of knowledge, but also increased the pressure on scribes to work quickly and cheaply. Mistakes became more common. So did complaints. One secular scribe, writing in Bologna around 1305, added in the margin, "God forgive the master who dictated this nonsense at such speed that my hand could not follow." Still, these city scribes helped transition the written word from the exclusive domain of monasteries to a broader world of law, commerce, and education. Women at the margins. Although the world of the scriptorium was overwhelmingly male, recent research has uncovered evidence of women scribes, particularly in female monasteries and convents. One of the most famous examples comes from the 12th century. German abbess Hildegard of Bingen, who not only wrote but composed, illuminated, and likely oversaw the production of her own manuscripts. In 2019, scientists studying the dental remains of a medieval woman in a German convent discovered microscopic traces of lapis lazuli, rare blue pigment used in illumination, embedded in her teeth. This suggests she worked closely with the pigment, possibly licking the brush or inhaling the dust while painting. Though their names were rarely recorded, these women labored in silence beside their male counterparts, contributing page by page to the preservation of history. The tedium of transmission, every book you've read that predates the printing press, every classical poem, ancient medical theory, or early chronicle was carried to you through the hands of scribes. Yet the work was slow, repetitive, and often thankless. Monastic rules sometimes warned of pride in beauty, urging scribes to focus on clarity over flourish. Yet others indulged in flourishes anyway. Some filled empty margins with stories, theological debates, or prayers for forgiveness. A few made jokes, drawing faces on letters, or inserting animals dressed like monks. Some manuscripts survive only in fragments bindings, taken apart, pages used to stuff shoes or wrap meat. And still, what remains tells a story of patience, persistence, and quiet human effort. How many mistakes went unnoticed? How many voices were lost? How many truths were subtly altered by the quill's hesitant scratch? And what does it mean that the most precious ideas in history were preserved not by the mighty, but by those hunched in candlelight, enduring silence, cold, and boredom, The centuries pass slowly in the pages of parchment. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Europe had changed. Cities were growing. Trade routes sprawled across land and sea. Universities bloomed, and with them a hunger for books, just Bibles and sermons, but philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and law. And yet the process of producing books had not evolved. Every copy still required human hands. Every text still depended on someone hunched in a cold room, with stiff fingers and smudged sleeves, tracing out familiar letters, stroke by stroke. But in a quiet workshop in Mainz, Germany, around the year 1440, that slow, unbroken tradition began to fracture. A man named Johannes Gutenberg, once a goldsmith, began tinkering with an idea that would bring the age of the scribe to a gradual but decisive close. The quill was about to meet its mechanical rival, the turning of the page, printing and its impact before printing. Copying a single book could take several months to a year. After Gutenberg's press, hundreds of identical pages could be produced in a week. Gutenberg didn't invent printing itself. Woodblock printing had existed in East Asia for centuries, but he revolutionized it. His innovation was movable metal, type, individual letters cast in lead that could be rearranged, inked, and pressed onto paper. It was efficient, scalable, and perhaps most threatening of all, to scribes nearly perfect in its uniformity. His most famous project, the Gutenberg Bible, was completed around 1455. It was majestic, 2 volumes, 1,282 pages, printed in a clear Gothic typeface designed to mimic the elegant scripts of the best scribes. Only about 180 copies were made, but they signaled the future. Monks and scholars marveled at the consistency. Every page matched the next. There were no trembling lines or accidental ink blots. Erasith, any were the fault of the typesetter, not the tired hand of a scribe. It was a transformation that would, over the next century, reduce the number of full-time scribes dramatically. And yet, for decades, the two systems overlapped. Coexistence and resistance in the late 15th century, even as printing presses spread across Europe, remained in operation. Not everyone trusted this new technology. Some scholars viewed printing with suspicion, too mechanical, too easy to corrupt. What if heretics printed false texts? What if books became so common they lost their sacredness? In many monasteries, handwritten books were still seen as superior. The scribe's labor was a form of prayer, a visible devotion. The irregularities, the careful corrections, even the fatigue visible in the handwriting, these were not flaws, but signs of human effort. In fact, the earliest printed books, called incunabula, were deliberately designed to look like manuscripts. Spaces were left for illuminators to add decorative initials. Some printers even hired former scribes to hand-embellish printed pages with gold leaf and marginalia. For a while, it seemed the two worlds might coexist, the cold ink of the scriptorium and the warm press of the printing shop. But time, as ever, pressed forward. The end of the scribe's era by 1500, printing presses had spread to over 250 cities across Europe. More than 20 million books had been printed up, staggering increase compared to the few thousand hand-copied volumes that had existed a century earlier. The economic advantages were impossible to ignore. A printed book might cost 1/10 of a hand-copied manuscript. A library once built over decades could now be assembled in a year. The role of the scribe, once essential, became increasingly ceremonial. Some monks continued to copy texts for pleasure or practice. Others focused on unique, illuminated manuscripts for royal patrons or religious ceremonies. But for most, the quill was set aside. In some places, entire scriptoria were dismantled. Writing desks were turned into reading tables. Shelves that once held parchment rolls now creaked under the weight of printed volumes. The silence of the scriptorium gave way to the clatter of movable type. And yet, something strange happened. Rather than being forgotten, the scribes were remembered. What was saved? Why do we know the names of some medieval scribes, when so many medieval peasants, soldiers, and even kings are lost to history? It is because scribes, in their quiet way, recorded themselves in margins, at the end of books, and sometimes hidden between the lines. They left behind notes. I wrote this in the year of our Lord 1383, in the 3rd week of Lent. It was cold. The night was long, and my eyes are tired. May God reward me for my work. Please, dear reader, pray for the soul of the man who wrote this. Their names, like their work, were humble, but they endured. And more than that, they preserved. The ancient world, without them, we would have no Virgil, no Cicero, no Aristotle. The scribes carried forward not just religious doctrine, but the fragile threads of science, philosophy, poetry, and law. Each manuscript, with its stains and quirks, tells a double story: the story of the text and the story of the person who copied it. Even now, in university archives and private collections, historians study these manuscripts not just for their content, but for their mistakes, corrections, and habits. A missing line might reveal a distracted monk. A doodle of a dog chasing a goose might suggest a memory or a wish, or a stolen glance through a window. A legacy written in silence. It's easy to romanticize the scribe, to imagine him noble and devout. But the truth was often more mundane and, perhaps, more beautiful for it. These were not great authors or visionaries. They were laborers, artisans, of ink, who sat down each morning and tried not to spill anything on the page. And still, in a world of war, disease, and upheaval, they wrote. Through plague years, through famines, through crusades and schisms, they copied and copied and copied. They preserved entire civilizations, not through conquest, but through care. Their legacy is not just in what they wrote, but in what they made possible. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment owe a quiet debt to the hands that shaped the letters of the past. And so, the next time you walk through a library, or flip through a book, whether a heavy academic tome or a dog-eared novel, remember this: before the presses, before the screens, before the click of a keyboard, there was a room. It was cold, it was silent, and in the dim light, someone just like you was writing, one careful line at a time. Imagine the sound of sandals on stone, not the slap of leather against dirt, but the gentle scuff of hobnailed soles across smooth, fitted blocks. The year is somewhere between 100 and 200 CE. The sun is high over the Italian peninsula, and in the faint distance, the low rumble of wagon wheels echoes across the Appian Way. You are walking on a Roman road, one of thousands that stretch across the empire, from Hispania to Mesopotamia, from the Scottish borderlands to the edge of the Sahara. These roads were more than infrastructure. They were the arteries of an empire, carrying messages, soldiers, goods, and gossip. And someone, somewhere, had to keep them from falling apart. This is the story not of the great roads' construction, but their maintenance and ongoing struggle against weeds, floods, frost, and wear. It's a slow story, a boring story. And yet, without it, the empire would not have endured. The myth of permanence. Roman roads have long been praised for their durability. Many still exist today, their stone foundations visible beneath modern streets or meandering through the countryside, half swallowed by grass. And it's truth, but they didn't last forever, and they didn't stay smooth on their own. Most Roman roads were not made of simple cobblestones. They were complex, layered constructions. A standard road had as many as 4 to 6 layers, each serving a purpose. Stamen, the bottom layer, made of large stones or rubble for drainage. Rudis, a layer of crushed stones or gravel mixed with lime. Nucleus, a finer layer of sand or cemented gravel for stability. Summum dorsum, the paving stones, large, flat stones, fitted together like a puzzle. Roads varied by region and terrain, but the core concept remained. They were elevated slightly in the center for drainage, cambered in engineering terms, and bordered by ditches or curbs. But even the most perfect road would begin to crack under the weight of years. And when it cracked, someone had to fix it. Who fixed the roads? The Roman road repair system was not centralized. There was no empire-wide highway agency, no single department of maintenance. Instead, repairs were often localized, handled by a patchwork of officials, communities, and even private citizens. For major roads, especially those leading to and from Rome, maintenance fell under the authority of a specific official, the curator, virum, the curator of roads. Appointed by the Senate or emperor, he was typically a high-ranking individual, often of senatorial rank, tasked with overseeing the condition of certain major roads. But the curator did not do the work himself. He had staff fiery who inspected roads, noted damage, and reported needs. Sometimes, soldiers from nearby forts were drafted to help. More often, road repairs were contracted out to local builders or maintenance crews. For secondary roads, the burden typically fell on local towns or provinces. municipal councils were expected to fund minor repairs, especially in the form of public obligations, kind of civic duty. Wealthy citizens might also contribute voluntarily as a form of prestige. An inscription found in Gaul reads, Marcus Licinius Felix, at his own expense, restored this road which had fallen into ruin. Such inscriptions weren't unusual. Repairing roads was considered an act of generosity, duty, and good Roman citizenship. The work itself, dust, sweat, and stones. Let's imagine a repair job in progress. Somewhere in southern Gaul, a section of road has sunken after a heavy winter. Water has undermined the substructure, and the paving stones are loose. A crew arrives, perhaps 6 or 8 men, most likely slaves or hired laborers. Their tools are basic chisels, picks, crowbars, mallets, and baskets. The first step is to remove the damaged stones. No small feat, as some of these slabs weigh hundreds of pounds. They pry them loose and stack them neatly by the roadside. Next, they dig down into the layers below, assessing damage. If the or stadamen layers are compromised, they must dig further. Fresh gravel or stone is brought in from a nearby quarry, loaded on ox carts. Lime is mixed, tamped, and leveled. Only then can the paving stones be returned to their places, often cut or reshaped to better fit the new surface. The process is slow. The goal is not speed, but endurance. A sloppy patch job might last a season. A good repair might last a generation. Inscriptions found near roads often include the phrase, "Reficite viam." He repaired the road. This wasn't just a mechanical task, it was a visible public service. And it wasn't just menial labor, either. Supervisors had to assess drainage angles, slope, foundation stability, and material quality. Common problems, not all glamour. What were the most frequent causes of road damage? Water, the Roman enemy, par excellence. Poor drainage led to frost damage in cold climates, especially in Britain or northern Gaul. Roads without ditches could become mud pits in the rainy season. Tree roots and vegetation left unchecked, they pushed up stones and broke the surface. Heavy wagons, while Roman roads were durable, they weren't made for endless tons of grain, stone, or iron. Earthquakes or shifting soil in regions like Asia Minor or Campania, tectonic movement meant roads had to be realigned or reconstructed. Human neglect. Sometimes roads simply fell out of use and were overtaken by grass. In such cases, travelers made their own paths alongside them, eroding the edges and contributing to decay. But often, repairs were made not only to fix damage, but to upgrade. Some towns widened roads, added milestones, or placed new curbs and gutters. Others paved previously dirt roads to improve connectivity. These improvements were often driven by political ambition, mayors or governors eager to be remembered. Milestones and records. One of the ways we know so much about Roman road repairs is through milestone stone markers placed along roads. Usually every Roman mile, approximately 1,480 meters. These stones were often inscribed not just with distance, but with names of emperors, governors, and repair sponsors. Some even give detailed repair records, such as, "This road, worn by time, was restored by order of Emperor Hadrian." The curators oversaw the work for 6 miles, from the city gate to the river bridge. Others are more humble, Lucius Marcius, surveyor, regraded the road after flooding washed away the surface. These records weren't just administrative, they were commemorative. The Romans saw road repair as part of civic memory, a way of binding generations through shared use of space. Every repaired mile became a mark of continuity. Roads beyond Rome, even outside the core provinces, road maintenance persisted. In Roman North Africa, surviving records show that cities like Carthage and Leptis Magna employed both engineers and contractors to maintain desert roads. In Britain, the Antonine Itineraria, kind of Roman travel guide, listed routes and stopping points, implying the existence of inspectors or curators responsible for keeping these distant paths usable. In the East, roads often followed older Greek or Persian routes, modified or expanded under Roman engineering standards, but repairs were still local. Roman roads didn't rely on a single imperial fund, but a network of local responsibility. This decentralization was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed repairs to be tailored to local needs, but it also meant that neglected regions could fall into disrepair quickly, especially during times of political instability or war. The sound of repair. So what did it sound like? This maintenance. Picture it. The clang of iron chisels on stone, the grunt of men lifting a slab, the creak of a wooden cart axle, the muffled thud of lime being tamped, the soft hiss of gravel pouring into a trench, and perhaps, once the workday ends, the sound of sandals again testing the new stretch, walking the restored mile. A quiet satisfaction, a road made whole. And yet, the questions linger. How many hands labored to preserve roads we no longer remember? How many repairs were anonymous, their workers never named, their tools buried by time? What does it mean that empires can rise on stone and still crumble into dust, You might imagine Roman roads as great triumphs of engineering, and they were. But even more than stone and mortar, they were built and sustained through something far less romantic: bureaucracy. While emperors and generals took credit for their construction, it was the endless churn of local officials, tax collectors, and record keepers who kept the roads passable. Each worn cobblestone, each restored curb or bridge abutment was paid for, authorized, and audited by an imperial machine that spanned continents, and like all machines, it sometimes squeaked, sometimes it stalled, and sometimes it failed completely. The Roman system of maintenance, decentralized and complicated, unlike modern nation-states. Rome didn't maintain a single, unified department of public works. Instead, the responsibility for road upkeep was fragmented across levels of governance. The state imperial level major roads, such as the Via Appia, Via Flaminia, or Via Augusta, were seen as vital to military and administrative control. Their maintenance often came under imperial oversight. But even then, funding and labor were often drawn locally. Municipal councils, each Roman town municipium had a local council, called the Ordo Decurionum, usually composed of wealthy, local men. This body was expected to fund local roads, bridges, and causeways within or near city limits. The expectation wasn't optional, it was civic duty. Private sponsors, wealthy individuals, could voluntarily fund repairs, either for political favor, personal pride, or eternal credit. These benefactors might sponsor an entire section of road, a bridge, or a single milestone often inscribed with their name and titles. Guilds and associations, in some cases, organized professional guilds, such as builders or wagoners, might contribute to repair efforts, especially if their business depended on a reliable route. Soldiers and prisoners in remote provinces or along newly conquered frontiers. Military engineers architecti oversaw roadwork. Soldiers in the legions frequently built and repaired roads between forts. So, while the Roman road system appeared seamless, it functioned more like a patchwork quilt stitched together by layers of obligation, ambition, and taxation. Funding the stones, taxes, tolls, and donations. How did they pay for all this? The answer lies in a blend of direct taxation, tolls, and mandatory contributions, sort of Roman version of public-private partnership. 1. Taxes and levies. Each Roman province collected taxes, typically in the form of land tax, tributum, soli, and poll tax, tributum, capitis. Portions of these revenues were earmarked for infrastructure, but rarely was it a fixed budget. Repairs had to be requested, approved, and justified, often with extensive documentation. A town might submit a request like, "A stretch of road leading to the northern aqueduct has been made impassable by flooding. We propose a repair team of 12 laborers under local supervision and request authorization for 300 denarii from the provincial treasury." The approval might take weeks or never come at all. In the meantime, traffic rerouted itself. 2. Tolls, portoria. Certain roads and bridges collected tolls, especially at provincial borders or near cities. These were paid by merchants transporting goods, not by casual travelers. Toll revenues were used for maintenance and guard wages. Some toll booths even had fixed tariffs. For example, one might charge 1 sestertius for a donkey, 4 sestertii for a 2-ox cart, 10 sestertii for a full wagon train. While minor, these sums added up and could be redirected into road upkeep or, as records often suggest, pocketed by local officials. 3. Voluntary gifts. This system blurred the line between philanthropy and self-promotion. Wealthy landowners, seeking favor or legacy, often funded roads or repairs and inscribed their names into public view. A classic example is found in Dalmatia. Tiberius Claudius Maximus, veteran of the cavalry, paved this road at his own expense for the honor of his hometown. The motivation wasn't purely selfless. Such inscriptions outlasted most reputations. In essence, a mile of road was a monument to oneself. Bureaucratic bottlenecks. When repairs were delayed, Roman officials were meticulous record keepers. But paperwork didn't always lead to action. Provinces often found themselves at odds with Rome when it came to repair priorities. Some problems were left unaddressed for years. Take the example of a Roman official named Lucius Valerius in the province of Britannia. A surviving tablet fragment shows him writing to the governor, "The stone bridge at mile marker 24 has collapsed. Local funds are insufficient. Divert dangerously to the marsh. I request immediate sanction for repairs." Historians suspect the repairs weren't completed for several years. No response to his plea survives. Why the delay? Competing priorities. Rome's treasury often prioritized military expenditures over road upkeep. Corruption. Local officials might misappropriate repair funds. Paper shortages in distant provinces. Even papyrus for communication could be scarce, causing administrative delays. There were also cases of overbuilding. Roads widened more than needed, bridges built in flood zones, drains rerouted with no engineer's input. Maintenance, once needed, became repair of the repair. Legal frameworks, binding the stones with law to bring order. Rome eventually developed legal codes around road maintenance. In the Digest of Justinian, compiled in the 6th century CE, but reflecting earlier practice, we find evidence of detailed regulations. Townspeople were obliged to clear obstructions near roads and bridges. Landowners were liable if their trees or irrigation damaged roads. Roads had to maintain a minimum width, typically 8 to 12 feet, especially near towns. Bridges had to be inspected seasonally, particularly after floods. Failure to comply could result in fines or temporary property seizure to fund repairs. Some towns employed road inspectors via who patrolled specific routes, checking for misuse, debris, or illegal encroachment. If a merchant built a stall too close to a public road, it could be torn down. All this gave the impression of tight control, but in practice, enforcement varied wildly by region. A town's burden for a mid-sized Roman town like Nemos's, modern NGM's, keeping its roads in good shape was an exhausting task. Records show that local councils assigned road overseers from among the town's decurions, maintained gravel pits and lime kilns to supply materials, hosted annual inspection tours to plan upcoming repairs, petitioned Rome for extra funds if the town was near a strategic border or had hosted imperial troops. Often, the worst sections were the edges of towns where local and provincial responsibility overlapped. These zones, sometimes sarcastically called the lands of no repair, became boggy death traps for wagons and pack animals. Complaints, scrawled onto wooden tablets or scratched into stone, survive in places like Vindolanda, near Hadrian's Wall. The road westward is a mud ditch. Wagons break their axles. No one has come to fix it. But the fixes came eventually, always slowly, always under negotiation. Repairs and reputation. One lesser-known aspect of road maintenance was its role in imperial image building. Emperors were often credited with repairs they did not personally oversee. Just as coins bore their faces, so did many milestones, even those far from Rome. Augustus, in his race, Gesta, claimed, "I restored 82 temples of the gods, and I repaired roads across the provinces." This was not a libot. It was a delegated truth. His appointed curators and governors did the work. But the image of the emperors, the restorer of order, keeper of civilization, depended on roads remaining open, smooth, and imperial. Even emperors with little administrative talent, like Caracalla or Commodus, had their names affixed to roads they never saw. And woe to the governor who failed to attach an emperor's name to a milestone. It was not merely a record, it was propaganda etched in basalt. The cost of forgetting, despite all this effort, many Roman roads did fall into disrepairably in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, as the empire strained under internal division, inflation, and external pressure. In these times, maintenance halted. Stone was stolen for building homes, ditches clogged, weeds grew. In some cases, entire roads vanished from use. replaced by animal tracks and informal trails. Yet, even then, the ghost of the road lingered. People remembered where the road should be, and sometimes, centuries later, those same routes were revived, rebuilt, or buried beneath new cities. In fact, many modern European highways follow the footprint of Roman roads not because of sentiment, but because Roman surveyors, with simple tools and boundless patience, had already found the most efficient paths. So the next time you find yourself stuck on a bumpy highway or waiting for a pothole crew to arrive, remember, road repair has never been glamorous, but it has always been essential, and it has always raised the same nagging questions. Who's responsible for this mess? When will someone fix it? And why does everything take so long, even in an empire that claimed to conquer time itself? The Roman Empire is gone. Its last Western emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE. Across Italy and Gaul, stone cities became quarries. Marble facades were stripped, melted for lime. Forums were plowed into wheat fields. And yet, through the silence of the centuries that followed, a faint sound endured, the slow, steady tread of feet on ancient stone. The roads remained, not all, of course. Some were reclaimed by forests, others crumbled under floods or war. But many Roman roads continued to guide the paths of people long after Rome itself was no longer a power. Their repair slowed, their milestones faded, but their influence echoed into the very shape of Europe. In this final section, we walk not with Roman legions or road crews, but with the generations that followed those who inherited, reused, and quietly rebuilt along the fading lines of Roman stones. The roads after Rome. By the 6th century, Roman infrastructure was in crisis. With the collapse of central authority in the West, no emperor remained to assign curators virum, no provincial governors to audit road budgets or inscribe stone milestones. The administrative machinery of maintenance had broken, and yet many roads survived because they still worked. Even without the empire, people needed to move. Farmers to market, messengers to monasteries, armies to distant borders. In fact, some roads became even more important in chaos, offering the only reliable means of travel through increasingly fragmented territories. In some places, local bishops assumed responsibility for maintaining old roads, especially those linking pilgrimage sites. Roman roads, even in decay, remained valuable, but their nature began to change. The pilgrim's path, one of the great ironies. These travelers walked, sometimes for months, sleeping in way stations, following the remnants of Roman stone. Bridges collapsed, wild growth overtaking old milestones, but they still followed them. Why? Because the Roman surveyors had already found the best way through the terrain. Even degraded, Roman roads retained their logic, straight where possible, curved where needed, dry when it mattered. For the weary pilgrim, this logic was salvation. A stable stretch of Roman road meant faster travel, fewer injuries, and one less night exposed to bandits or storms. The rural recovery, paths of stone in a weedy world in the countryside, where few formal institutions remained. Villagers often turned to Roman roads as building material. Some roads were stripped for their paving stones, used in churches, barns, or manor houses. Others were plowed under or turned into irrigation ditches. But even then, their paths remained visible in the contours of fields, the straightness of hedgerows, the lines of property boundaries. In fact, in parts of France, Italy, and Spain, archaeologists still trace Roman roads by examining aerial photography or satellite imagery, looking for patterns of unnatural regularity in the landscape. In this way, even vanished roads influenced the layout of farms, villages, and regions, and some roads never vanished. The Via Appia, Rome's oldest and most famous road, continued to be used for centuries after the empire's fall. Though some sections degraded, others remained passable. Pilgrims used it, peasants used it, traders continued to haul goods from Campania to Rome along its battered but enduring path. Even Charlemagne's messengers in the 9th century likely walked parts of it. Medieval repairs, quiet work, forgotten names throughout the early Middle Ages. Patchwork repairs were made to key road sections, but these were not commemorated with inscriptions. We have few records of who fixed what. Sometimes the only evidence is anomalous paving styles, different from Roman technique, but clearly placed with intention. In some monasteries, records mention lay brothers being sent to clear the stone path to the east, or requests to mend a ford over an old Roman bridge. These references are faint, a passing mention in a letter or monastic account, but they speak to a world where survival demanded use of the old ways. Occasionally, rulers did try to restore Roman roots, often using Roman roots as the foundation. In England, King Alfred the Great ordered roads repaired to allow for faster troop movement against Viking raids, many of which followed Roman military paths. In 13th century Italy, communes like Florence and Bologna invested heavily in reviving ancient roads to support growing commerce. But even these efforts didn't fully return to Roman standards. Instead, roads became hybrids, Roman bones with medieval skin, memory and misuse, legends along the road. Over time, Roman roads began to acquire myths. In Britain, the Fosswaya Roman military road was believed to have been built by giants. In France, sections of the Via Agrippa were called Devil's Paths, with rumors that no grass grew because the stones had been cursed. In Italy, roadside stones were mistaken for ancient altars, and travelers sometimes left coins or prayers on them. Superstitions layered over engineering. These stories reveal how much the Roman road had faded from practical knowledge into folklore. People knew the roads were ancient, knew they were built by someone great, but not necessarily how or why, yet they still followed them. Roman roads had become ghosts. You could walk invisible, tangible, but divorced from their origin. The long shadow, and then came modernity. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as scientific surveying and nation-building gained momentum, European states began to study and reconstruct road systems, and in doing so, they often rediscovered the remarkable precision of Roman routes. Engineers found that many highways like the Via Domitia in France or the Watling Street in Britain still offered the most direct and practical route between major centers. In some cases, modern roads were built directly over Roman foundations. The A1 motorway in Britain follows parts of Ermine Street, a Roman road. Italy's SS7, known as the modern Via Appia, continues the same path laid down 2,300 years ago. Spain's N340 traces the line of the Via Augusta, connecting the Mediterranean coast. Without necessarily realizing it, millions of modern drivers still move through Rome's infrastructure, though the names have changed. Roads without glory. And so we return to the original premise that this is a boring history. No great battles were fought in these stories. No revolutions sparked on the backs of cobblestones. But something quieter happens, something more enduring. The Roman road wasn't just a tool for conquest. It was a framework for continuity. It connected farmsteads to towns, soldiers to commands, pilgrims to shrines, and letters to loved ones. Its repair wasn't glamorous, and its decay wasn't catastrophic. It was gradual, it was human, it was ignored and it wasn't. And perhaps that's why it matters. Because in the end, history isn't only made in temples or thrones. Sometimes it's made in a ditch beside a stretch of worn stone, where a man with a shovel tries to keep a road from vanishing. It is dawn, and the courtyard of a medieval castle is already alive with movement. Servants scurry about with buckets and bundles. A scullery maid groans under the weight of damp cloth. At the far side of the yard, steam curls from a great iron cauldron suspended over a fire pit. The smell is pungent wood smoke, lye, and something musty, something old. This is wash day at the castle, and it is no small affair. Today, you'll not hear tales of knights or feasts. Instead, we'll explore the quiet, essential, and rarely mentioned task that kept the great houses from reeking laundry. Because, while castles evoke images of grandeur, beneath the banners and battlements lay a daily, unending struggle against filth. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages, a mixed reality. Modern myths often portray the medieval world as a place of filth and squalor, where baths were rare and laundry even rarer. But the truth is more nuanced. While daily washing of full outfits was unrealistic due to the scarcity of water, fuel and labor, linen underclothes and bed linens were washed regularly, especially in noble households. Personal hygiene mattered, particularly among the upper classes. The real challenge wasn't willingness, it was logistics. A single medieval castle might house dozens or even hundreds of people. The lord's family, visiting nobles, squires, guards, cooks, stable hands, and a rotating cast of laborers and guests. All of them needed at least some clean bedding, towels, or linen shirts. And someone, usually a group of women and servants, had to make that happen. The castle laundry hierarchy. Laundry in a medieval estate was a task split between status, labor, and heat tolerance. The laundress lavandera, or laundressa, was the senior-most figure in the laundry operation. In larger castles, she might oversee multiple assistants. She was often a trusted servant, handling both the lord's linens and sensitive garments. Assistant laundresses handled washing, wringing, and drying. Water carriers, often young boys or new servants, transported water to and from rivers or wells, sometimes hundreds of times in a single wash day. Fire tenders kept boiling cauldrons going. These were dangerous jobs. A misstep could result in severe burns or worse. Laundry was gendered work, but men occasionally assisted, especially with water, transport, or woodcutting. The tools of the trade. Medieval washing didn't use soap as we know it. Instead, the key ingredient was lye alkaline solution, made by pouring water through wood ash. When mixed with urine, yes, human urine, it created a powerful, if repellent, cleaning agent. Essential laundry equipment included copper or iron cauldrons for boiling linens, wooden tubs and washing troughs, paddles or beetles, flat bats used to beat fabrics clean, boards and stones for scrubbing, drying racks, hedgerows, or ropes, strung across courtyards. In winter, linens were often frozen stiff before they dried. There are records of blankets snapping in half from frost after being hung too long. Everything required strength, timing, and coordination. The process A. Medieval wash day. Let's walk through a typical linen washing session for a moderately sized castle in the 13th century. 1. Preparation. Laundry wasn't done daily, it was too exhausting. Instead, castles set aside designated wash days, often monthly or seasonally, depending on climate and need. In noble households, laundry might be done more frequently to keep fine linen fresh. Preparation began the night before. Water was collected and stored in large barrels. Ash was gathered for lye. Fires were set. If river access was available, the laundry crew rose early and made their way to the banks, bringing everything with them. If not, water had to be drawn from wells and hauled in buckets to the courtyard or laundry chamber. 2. Sorting and soaking. Linens were sorted by type. Fine garments belonging to nobles were separated from coarser fabrics worn by servants. Clothes were soaked in warm lye water or in a mixture of lye and stale urine. This solution loosened grease, body oils, and biological stains. Soaking could last hours or overnight. 3. Scrubbing and beating after soaking. Laundresses scrubbed the linens against stones or wooden boards. Others beat them with wooden paddles to force out dirt and suds. This was done by hand muscle over machinery. Some castles had semi-enclosed washrooms with drainage channels and benches, but most relied on open courtyards or riverbanks. There are records of laundry crews singing in rhythm as they worked, both to coordinate movement and to pass the time. One 14th century French song literally translates to, "Strike the shirt, turn the sheet, the sun is high and we must eat." 4. Boiling. Next came the boil. Heavy-duty fabric sheets, undergarments, or bandages were placed in huge cauldrons over open flame. The water boiled for an hour or more. Some clothes were double boiled, especially after illness, to reduce the risk of spreading disease. But boiling could damage cloth, so finer pieces were simply soaked and rinsed. 5. Rinsing. Boiled and scrubbed laundry was rinsed in clean water, river water, or water drawn and stored for this purpose. Multiple rinses were often needed to remove the harsh smell of lye. Fresh herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint might be thrown in during the final rinse to scent the cloth. 6. Drying. Linens were wrung by hand, twisted and beaten to expel water and hung on hedges, lines, or tree branches. In castles with towers or battlements, ropes were strewn high to catch the sun and wind. Drying could take a full day. If it rained, the work had to be repeated. Damp or poorly dried linens could mildew quickly, especially in colder months, something noted with alarm in castle records. Castle life and the constant struggle for clean linens. For a castle's lord or lady, clean linen was a mark of status. Even if outer garments went unwashed, a crisp linen shirt and fresh sheets signaled wealth and care. But this comfort came at a cost. Behind the scenes, an army of workers lifted, scrubbed, stirred, and hauled to keep appearances. Records from the English royal household in the 14th century show that the laundry office employed over a dozen full-time workers, plus seasonal helpers. Inventories included hundreds of linen sheets and shirts, rotated in sets, dozens of napkins and tablecloths, changed after every banquet, washcloths for nobles' personal use, sanitary cloths for monthly use, also laundered with care. Every piece had to be tracked, marked, and mended, creating an early form of linen bookkeeping. Lost or damaged linens were deducted from servants' pay. The risks of the job medieval laundry work was exhausting and dangerous. Burns from hot water were common. Frostbite threatened during winter washes by rivers. Chemical irritation from lye and urine could damage skin, especially on hands. Heavy lifting led to back and joint injuries, especially among older laundresses. Worse still, during plagues or epidemics, laundry became a vector for transmission. Washing the bedding of the sick was both vital and perilous. Some laundresses died shortly after tending to plague victims, though their deaths were rarely recorded beyond the payroll. And yet, the work continued, quietly, consistently, out of sight, but never out of need. By the end of the day, the courtyard would be filled with damp, steaming cloth. The sun would dry some, others would remain overnight. The laundry crew, aching and blistered, might eat together, sharing bread, cheese, and gossip before collapsing into straw beds. And then, after a week or two of relative peace, the cycle would begin again. But here is the strange thing. Despite the volume, the effort, the endless repetition, we barely remember them. Their names are absent from castle plaques. Their stories are not part of heroic ballads. And yet, without them, the castle would stink. Disease would spread. Silk would yellow. Lords would squirm in soiled bedsheets. So we ask, how do we honor the unseen hands that kept even the grandest halls livable? What else did they scrub clean beyond cloth and chamber? In the great hall of a medieval castle, banners hang from the rafters. Fire crackles in the hearth. A lord dines on roast meat, while a squire stands by with a pitcher of wine. But behind the rich display, somewhere deeper in the structure, perhaps, beneath the kitchens or near the stables, someone sits hunched over a wooden table. By candlelight, she is not writing poetry or illuminating a manuscript. Instead, she is marking fabric with tiny stitches, red thread on white linen. The initials are not hers. She is a laundress or linen keeper, and the stitch she sews is a symbol of property and power. Each item of cloth must be accounted for, washed, dried, folded, and returned to the correct noble, guest, or soldier. If a towel goes missing, someone will be held responsible. And so begins another invisible chapter of castle life, the administration of laundry, where every thread, every wash, every misstep had consequences. The value of linen in a medieval world. To understand why laundry mattered, we must first understand linen itself. Linen was not cheap. It was made from the flax plant, which required labor-intensive harvesting, retting, soaking the stalks in water for weeks to loosen fibers, breaking, combing, spinning, and weaving. Each of these steps could take weeks or months. Flax was grown across Europe but processed locally, making linen a regional, handcrafted commodity. The resulting fabric was breathable, durable, and relatively easy to clean. It was also prized for being white, a color associated with purity and visibility. Dirt on linen showed instantly, which meant nobles could signal their cleanliness by simply being visibly unstained. Linen was used for undershirts, chemises, or shifts, bedsheets, and pillowcases, towels and handkerchiefs, tablecloths and napkins, bandages and sanitary cloths. All of this linen had to be managed. The laundry ledger in noble and royal households. Linen wasn't just washed, was tracked, carefully, obsessively. These records, known as linen lists, were early forms of inventory control. They listed number of items, e.g. 48 shirts, 22 pillowcases, 14 tablecloths, fabric quality coarse, fine, embroidered ownership, lord, lady, guest, child, servant, condition, new, worn, torn, missing. Many castles employed a linen mistress, or keeper of the wardrobe, who was responsible for this record-keeping. She often worked closely with laundresses to ensure nothing was lost or misused. One 15th century inventory from a French noble household included 6 linen tunics marked with a red cross for the lord, 12 undershirts embroidered with fleur-de-lis for noble guests, 4 small cloths designated for wound binding, 1 towel burned on one edge noted. But retained. This attention to detail was not bureaucratic fuss, it was economic survival. Linen was expensive. Theft, wear, or carelessness could cost the estate heavily. In many households, servants were charged if they lost or ruined a piece. Laundry marks, ownership in thread to avoid confusion during laundering. Most linens were marked. These laundry marks were sewn or inked onto each item, identifying both ownership and rank. Some were as simple as initials, J.D.W. for John, D. Warren, or Mr. for Maria Regina Queen Mary. Others were symbols, crosses, crowns, stars, or family crests stitched in colored thread. Sometimes a number followed the initials, indicating the item's sequence. LH3 might denote Lady Howise's third towel. Marks had to be durable enough to survive soaking, boiling, wringing, and sun-drying. Red and blue threads were common for visibility and resistance to fading. More elaborate houses even had linen books matching each item's mark to a written entry, effectively a medieval tracking system. If a shirt returned unmarked or a fine towel was lost during washing, disciplinary action followed. Punishment for lost linens. Servants, especially laundresses, were held accountable for linens under their care. In some regions, loss of linen was considered theft by neglect, even if accidental. A laundress who allowed a guest's shirt to be burned or misplaced might be fined, demoted, or dismissed. There are surviving cases where disputes over linens were brought before manor courts or household stewards. In one example from 1349 England, Agnes the washerwoman is charged with failing to return to linen headcloths to the ladies' chamber. She claims they were taken by the steward's boy. The steward denies this. Judgment is withheld. In royal courts, the stakes were higher. In 14th century Burgundy, a laundress was arrested for attempting to sell used linen belonging to the Duchess. She had hidden 3 monogrammed undertunics and offered them to a merchant in Dijon. She was flogged and expelled from service. Even honest mistakes had consequences. Seasonal cleaning, spring, summer, and war laundry frequency varied by season. In spring and summer, large washes were scheduled to coincide with warmer, drying weather. In autumn, linens were aired before storage. In winter, washing was minimal, fuel was scarce, water froze, and drying was risky. But the most dramatic changes came with military campaigns. When a noble or king went to war, they often took a mobile laundry unit with them, carts full of linens, laundresses, and water carriers. These field laundries washed garments for knights and officers, especially undergarments worn beneath armor. At the Battle of Agincourt, 1415, English records show that over 40 laundresses accompanied the army not for luxury, but necessity. Dirty linens led to rashes, sores, and infection, particularly under metal. Laundry became a matter of health and morale. Infection, plague, and the dangerous cloth was not just a fabricate, was a carrier. During epidemics, especially the Black Death, fear of infected linens led to widespread burning of clothing and bedding. Some castles banned outside laundry altogether, insisting that only in-house staff handle garments. After an outbreak, laundresses sometimes boiled clothes in vinegar, salt water, or urine, believing it would drive out disease. Hospitals, monasteries, and even military garrisons developed isolation laundry areas, where infected cloth was processed far from living quarters. Workers there were quarantined, sometimes for weeks. One monastic rule from 1380 required, "No sister shall carry the garments of the sick without gloves, and must wash her hands in brine before re-entering the hall." Still, many laundresses died after repeated exposure to contaminated bedding. The work had honor, but no safety net. Ironing and folding, the final steps once washed and dried. Linens were folded carefully and often ironed or pressed not for appearance alone, but to conserve space and remove creases that could harbor pests. Pressing was done with stone or metal smoothing tools. Early irons, heavy boards, and weights, sometimes glossing stones for fine cloth. Each noble's linens were stored separately, often in locked chests, linen cupboards, or armoires. Access was limited to key staff. The presentation of clean linen was a ritual. A fresh towel at mealtime, a pressed shirt laid out on a bench before dressing, handkerchiefs perfumed with herbs, a folded sheet placed at the foot of a guest's bed. These small gestures carried enormous symbolic weight, not only of cleanliness, but of control, refinement, and discipline. Linen as inheritance. In some noble families, linens were so valuable they were bequeathed in wills. A 15th century English will reads, "To my daughter Isabel, I leave my 12 linen sheets for fine tablecloths with the blue border and the bed linen of my marriage." These linens represented wealth, dowry, and care. The clean, well-maintained sheet was not just comfort, it was legacy. And so we return to the thread. In castles where scribes recorded battles and births, where lords planned war and justice, where tapestries hung on stone walls, there were also women with needles, pots, and lists, keeping track of every towel. Their work was not glorious. It was meticulous. It was expected. And it held the great houses together, one marked, mended, and managed sheet at a time. Somewhere inside the castle walls, near the kitchen gardens, but not quite next to the stables, there's a square patch of ground marked by trampled grass, barrels, and ropes strung between poles. It is not the grand hall, nor the chapel, nor the tower. It is the laundry yard. And here, in the heart of this quiet, laboring space, we find one of the castle's strangest paradoxes. In the most overlooked corner of noble life, some of the most constant, communal, and deeply human. Activity unfolded. Laundry was not just labor, it was life. It brought people together, forged relationships, taught daughters and nieces, and became, over generations, a rhythm as reliable as the tides. In this final section, we step away from the logistics and into the lives of the people who boiled, scrubbed, folded, and endured. A woman's domain, but not always her choice. While castles were ruled by men in armor, many inner workings were governed by women. Laundry was one of them both, as duty and identity. Most laundresses were female, especially in large, noble estates. The work was considered feminine, in part because it was physically unthreatening to the masculine order of weapons and war, but also because it was tied to nurturing, health, and cleanliness. But this did not mean laundresses were respected. They were often poor, sometimes widowed or unmarried, and nearly always of lower status. They were not invited to dine with cooks or stablemen. In some places, they weren't even allowed in the castle proper unless summoned. Their workspace was peripheral both physically and socially, and yet, within their own circle, they built networks of support. Elder laundresses trained younger girls. Mothers taught daughters how to soak wool without shrinking it, how to avoid burn scarring, how to salvage stained cloth. There were whispered stories of near accidents, laughter over slips in icy water, grief over injuries that ended a servant's career. Laundry was a harsh world, but it was also a shared one. Songs, jokes, and quiet resistance. In a world where reading and writing were rare among servants, oral tradition thrived. And in the laundry yard, women told stories, recited rhymes, and sang. Some songs were work chanset to the rhythm of wringing or beating fabric. Twist and pull, and twist again. The Lord sweats wine, and we get rain. Others were jokes, darkly funny, about noble undergarments or impossible stains. There was resistance here, too. Laundry offered a place to speak, semi-privately, to complain, to trade gossip, to process fear or outrage. It was where rumors of unwanted advances, unfair deductions, or cruel overseers were whispered and, sometimes, remembered. One 15th century record from a Flemish estate returned with proper wood. Their protest wasn't inscribed in poetry or history, but it's in the ledger, marked delay for cause of women's discontent. In a world with few rights, the laundry yard became, sometimes, a space of agency. The public side of private work, laundry straddled the line between the intimate and the visible. The items handled bed linens, undergarments, sanitary cloths were deeply personal. They bore the body's imprint. Blood, sweat, illness, childbirth, incontinence, all of it passed through the laundress's hands. These women knew who had a fever last week, who stained their shift with red in the wrong season, who wore perfume and who didn't, who kept spare linens clean between washes, and who didn't bother. The laundress, by nature of her work, had knowledge no one else did, and she was expected to say nothing. At the same time, laundry was publicly aired. Literally, lines of damp cloth fluttered in castle courtyards. Guests could see who had the finest sheets, the largest napkins, the best embroidered collars. Clean linen was part of status, displacing but powerful. So even as laundresses were marginalized, they played a central role in shaping how others were perceived. Their labor became the backdrop of noble appearance. Weather, seasons, and the great enemy, time, one of the greatest challenges of castle. Laundry wasn't the fabric, or even the labor, it was timing. Laundry could not be rushed. Soaking took hours. Boiling took longer. Drying was at the mercy of weather. If a feast was planned, or a noble guest arrived early, laundry crews had to work through the night, drying linens by firelight, risking burns and ruined cloth. There are accounts of wet sheets strung across castle halls, drying behind tapestries, to be ready by dawn. Winter was the worst. In frost, water froze inside barrels. Fabric stiffened on lines and tore if handled too roughly. Boiling water steamed into cold air and fogged the courtyard. Towels sometimes had to be laid on wooden slats in attics or near the kitchen oven, where they dried slowly and sometimes caught fire. Still, the pressure was constant. No matter the season, someone always needed clean linen. The economy of waste, patching, reuse, and ragwork. Not all linens were laundered forever. Once a shirt or sheet was too torn or stained to present to nobility, it was recycled. Old linens were cut into bandages for wounds, turned into rags for dusting or cleaning, repurposed into sanitary cloths. Diapering or wrapping bundles, sometimes given to the poor as charity, though rarely the finest types. Laundresses sometimes kept small scraps, using them for mending personal garments. In some cases, old linens were sold or traded by the castle's steward, creating a small side economy. Nothing was wasted. Linen was too precious. There are even records of parchment makers using worn-out linen rags in the process of paper-making, your transition from body to word. Life after laundry. What became of the laundresses? Most remained in service for as long as their strength held. The work was physical, wringing wet sheets, hauling water, carrying boiling pots. By 40, many had sore joints and bad backs. Some retired into lesser roles, folding linens, tracking inventory, or instructing girls in the basics. Others found husbands among the castle staff, married out, or became midwives. Very few left records of their own, but we glimpse them occasionally, in payment rolls, in complaint ledgers, in footnotes of wills. To Maud, who has washed my linen these 30 years, I leave to silver groats and a green shawl. Their lives were not memorialized with tombs or tapestries, but their labor endured in the quiet cleanliness of others. The hidden clock of a castle. If you stood outside a medieval castle for a day, you'd hear bells ringing for prayer, the clang of iron at the forge, the voices of cooks and guards. But if you listened closely, you might also hear the snap of cloth in the wind, the creak of wooden tubs being emptied, the soft grunts of women pulling rope through wet linen, the low murmur of a song in an unfamiliar tongue. These were the sounds of another clock, not wound by gears, but by seasons, stains, and schedules. A clock measured in wash days. And though history prefers swords and crowns, this clock kept the castle running. So we end this story not with a triumph, but with a question. How many unnamed hands have held up civilization, not by command or conquest, but by care? And how often do we forget that behind every clean shirt, every laid table, every unrumpled bed, there was once someone soaking, scrubbing, and folding in the cold. Somewhere in the stone belly of a monastery, the air smells of ink, wax, and sheep. Candles gutter on narrow wooden desks, puddling their light into fragile circles. From the high window, rain drums faintly on the slate roof. The breeze has found a crack in the wall, and now flutters the corner of a half-finished page. A monk puts down his quill. He has just blotted his fifth mistake of the hour. Outside, the crops may be wilting. Inside, the ink won't dry. Welcome to the forgotten labor of medieval scribes, copyists, clerics, and chroniclers who battled weather as much as they battled fatigue. Their job was to preserve knowledge word by word. But before the printing press, every book was made by hand, and even the smallest change in humidity or temperature could turn the act of writing into an ordeal. In this story, we step into their world: cold fingers, bad ink, misbehaving, parchment tanned. The never-ending struggle to produce a clean, legible, holy text before the sun went down. The scriptorium, a workshop of quiet war. The scriptorium was the nerve center of any monastery or cathedral school. Often located on an upper floor, it was designed to catch as much daylight as possible. Windows were narrow, more for draft control. Then comfort and heating was minimal. Fire posed too great a risk around dry parchment. In theory, the room was silent. In practice, it was full of soft sounds: the scraping of knives across vellum, the faint rasp of quill on page, occasional murmured curses, and always the scratching pause of waiting for wet ink to dry. Scriptoria operated under strict routines. Most monks wrote during daylight only. Candlelight was both wasteful and straining on the eyes. Some worked in pairs, one reading aloud, the other writing. Others worked alone in silence, copying sacred texts or legal documents, hour after hour. But whether monk or hired lay scribe, all faced the same enemy: environmental inconsistency. The materials, ink, quills, and vellum, the medieval writing toolkit, was deceptively simple. But each part had quirks, and weather made them worse. The quill made from feathers of geese, swans, or crows. Quills had to be cut to shape using a penknife. The nib wore down quickly, especially on coarse vellum. Cold made the quill brittle. Humidity made it bend or split. Most scribes carried multiple quills, swapping them out as they dulled or frayed. The vellum, true parchment called vellum, was made from calf, sheep, or goatskin. It was smoothed, scraped, stretched, and treated with lime. But even after preparation, vellum was alive. It curled in humidity. It stiffened in cold. It wrinkled under warm hands or bent when ink was too wet. Some scribes weighted their pages with lead tokens to keep them flat. Others used tiny awls to punch pinprick holes for margins, only to watch those margins shift as the page warped through the day. As one 12th century scribe wrote in the margin of a wrinkled manuscript, "This skin was not properly stretched. God help the words that must walk across it." The ink was often made from oak galls. Tumors on oak trees caused by parasitic wasps mixed with iron salts and gum arabic. This iron gall ink was black, permanent, and sticky. But here was the problem: it dried slowly, especially in damp or cold air. On a humid day, it might take minutes per line to dry fully. Pages smeared easily. Fingertips darkened with accidental smudges. Scribes sometimes wrote only a few lines per hour, then stopped to wave the sheet or wait in frustration. More than one manuscript includes margin notes like "Rain today." "I write, I wait, I curse," marginalia, where scribes complained. Medieval manuscripts are filled with marginalian notes in the margins that sometimes reflect theological insight, but often reflect fatigue and mild despair. Among the best-known scribe complaints, "This parchment is hairy. Oh, my hand. Thank God it will soon be dark. The ink is thin." Let the reader not blame the scribe for the weather. In one Irish manuscript, Monk writes, mid-page, "Cold, cold, cold. My feet are cold. The ink is frozen." These notes, humorous in hindsight, are deeply human. They show that writing was not serene artistry, but physical labor shaped by environmental constraint. A damp afternoon could ruin an entire day's work, a war of inches, blotting, smoothing, and starting over to cope with their ink problems. Scribes developed workarounds. Blotting sand or powder was sprinkled on fresh ink to soak up moisture, but it could cause grit and abrasion. Some used crushed chalk or bone dust to dry faster. Others kept warm stones nearby to gently warm the inkpot, or their hands careful not to crack the parchment with too much heat. A few desperate scribes heated pages near lamps or sunlight, occasionally warping the vellum beyond repair. When all else failed, a blotched section had to be scraped away with a penknife and smoothed with pumice. But too much scraping left holes, requiring repairs with thread or glue. Mistakes were not easily forgiven, especially not in religious manuscripts, where divine words could not be casually smeared. One 14th-century rulebook from a Benedictine abbey reads, "Let no man leave ink standing upon the page as puddles in the rain. If his hand be unsteady, let him pray and begin again." Damp ink, cold hands, and holy deadlines. Most scriptoria had schedules to meet feast days, visits from bishops, or commissions from wealthy patrons. But the ink didn't care. Even when monks hurried, they had to stop between each word to allow drying. Some tried to skip around writing alternate lines, then returning later to fill in the gaps. This often led to misalignments, spacing issues, and more corrections. Add to this, cramped hands from holding a stiff quill, blurred vision from poor lighting, cold joints from unheated rooms, fatigue from fasting or long prayer hours. And the result was an uphill climb through every sentence. Still, they wrote, because the demand for books, sacred, legal, medical, scientific, was growing, and someone had to do the copying. Someone had to fight the ink. By the end of a wet day, a scribe might have completed only a few pages. His back ached, his fingers were blackened, his writing, once careful, trailed into tired squiggles. He might sign off with a final note, finished at last, "May God forgive my ink." So we end this section with an ink-stained hand hovering above a nearly dry word. The scribe waits, watches, breathes into his fingers. He does not move too quickly. He knows the war is not over. Tomorrow may be worse. And yet, he writes, because the work must be done, because memory must be preserved, even when the ink won't dry. The page lies open on the desk. It's nearly full. Each letter carefully shaped, every line ruled with patience, but one word, sacred names, misspelled. The ink has already dried. The scribe exhales and closes his eyes. His hand trembles. He cannot simply cross it out. To blot or deface a holy name could be considered sacrilege, and yet he cannot leave the error uncorrected. Too many eyes will read it. Too many voices will recite what he has copied. This was the scribe's burden, not only of cold and fatigue, but of perfection under pressure. Because writing, in the Middle Ages, was not just labor, it was divine responsibility. Errors were inevitable, but not forgivable before printing. There were no edits in the modern sense, no undo button. Every correction had to be made manually with careful scraping, covering, or creative rephrasing. But even a minor error, missing word, a reversed letter, an incorrect spelling could have enormous consequences. A mistranscribed legal clause could change the meaning of a contract. A wrong date could alter church calendars or royal genealogies. A distorted scripture could mislead preachers, theologians, or kings. Worse, many scribes were working from copies of copies, often in different dialects or languages. A Latin manuscript from Rome might be copied by a monk in York who only half understood its abbreviations. And if that copy was later used in Paris, the error might compound across generations. Some scribes tried to correct errors, silently adjusting grammar, smoothing awkward phrases. Others flagged them openly with marginal notes like sic as written forte error, possibly an error corrigator. Let it be corrected. A few left short confessions. This part was unclear in the master copy. I followed the old text, though it seemed false. My hand slipped. Forgive me. Holy names, human hands, certain words were considered too sacred to alter or mishandle, especially the names of God, saints, or Christ. Scribes often paused to ritually wash before writing the tetragrammaton, YHWH. In Christian scriptoria, monks wrote Dominus or Deus with exaggerated care, often in red ink or gold leaf. Mistakes in these names were deeply troubling. Some monasteries developed protocols. If a scribe misspelled a divine name, he might cut out the word and stitch in a patch with the correct spelling, recopy the entire page, in extreme cases, destroy the sheet entirely. A 13th century English monk recorded, a young brother did write Dominus with one stroke missing. The master did order penance, and the page burned. Errors were not just technical, they were moral. Margins, a scribe's secret space. The margins of medieval manuscripts were never truly empty. Later additions, and often personal commentary, some were serious. See the gloss of Jerome on this verse. This is a common error in the Greek. Others were weary or ironic. I am tired. The ink is bad. The master is watching. In scholastic texts, students added scribbles and jokes in the margins, tiny drawings of monks with animal heads, rude comments about the teacher, or full debates with invisible interlocutors. Nida, repeated motif across centuries. No one knows precisely why. Was it satire? Boredom? A symbol of futility? In this way, the margin became a space where the human scribe peeked out from behind the sacred text. Writing as spiritual discipline for monastic scribes. The act of copying was not simply reproduction, it was a form of devotion. To write the Psalms was to absorb them. To copy the Gospels was to dwell within them. Each letter inscribed was a step in meditative labor, training the mind through the body. The rule of Saint Benedict, widely followed across Europe, instructed monks to spend several hours daily in reading and copying. It was considered a kind of monastic fasting of the tongue, silent, controlled, focused. But spiritual ideals met physical reality. A monk who had not slept well, who was hungry, cold, or sick might still be expected to copy hundreds of lines in a day. No complaining, no quitting. The result was often mental exhaustion, and yet, even in fatigue, the scribe kept writing, because every copied word was a brick in the wall of preservation, of faith, law, and knowledge. The slow spread of knowledge. The labor of scribes allowed ideas to move, albeit slowly. One manuscript might take months to copy, and even then, it was unique. No two copies were alike. Variations in spelling, phrasing, and punctuation meant that each version became its own textual tradition. Still, copied texts spread. A commentary written in Bologna might be copied in Oxford. A Roman missal might appear decades later in a small Welsh priory. A medical text translated from Arabic might circulate among monasteries and universities, with annotations in Latin, French, and Greek. In this way, the scribe became a funnel of transmission, not a thinker, necessarily, but a bridge. Some became renowned for their clarity or speed. Others left only initials or marginal notes. Most remain nameless. Sometimes the scribe writes, "No more ink. The quill has failed. I must rest." In these lines, we glimpse something profoundly human: limitation. Despite their devotion, despite their training, scribes were people with sore hands, blurry eyes, and tired backs. They were interrupted by illness, chores, bells for prayer, and, often, the weather. Still, they returned, because the page had to be filled, the margin had to be ruled, the knowledge had to survive. And so they bent once more over vellum, dipped their quills, and whispered the words aloud as they wrote, "In principio erat verbum." In the beginning was the word. So we end here, in the margin of a sacred page where ink has dried at last, but the human voice still echoes what is more fragile than words, written by hand in damp stone rooms. And yet what? A PhD student opens a dusty box in a European cathedral's archives centuries later. There is a worn manuscript within, protected by padded cloth and meticulous tissue. The vellum has become yellow. The binding is sloppy. Surprisingly, though, the pages are still there. Whoever reads this, remember the one who wrote it, is written toward the conclusion in tiny brown ink. No name, no date, only the faint outline of an ink-based life. Suddenly, we find ourselves back among the scribes, not the well-known writers, popes, or monarchs, but the anonymous copyists who preserve the writings of others. They occupied chilly chambers. They used flashing light to write. They had cramping in their fingertips. They froze their ink. Nevertheless, they wrote, and knowledge survived in this way. Scribes and memory's vulnerability, oral tradition, served as the foundation for the medieval world, but writing kept it going. Memory was restricted to what could be sung, whispered, or remembered by a select few in the absence of scribes. Memory became external with scribes. They kept scriptures such as sermons, missals, the Bible, and Psalter's knowledge of science books on astronomy, medicine, and agriculture, land titles, royal charters, and legal codes, literature, and myth, including epic sagas, saints' biographies, and classical poetry letters, inventory, recipes, only because someone, somewhere, decided to transcribe them slowly, painstakingly, and frequently in discomfort. Do many of these manuscripts still survive today? Their writing was necessary, even though it wasn't particularly creative. Without scribes, Renaissance ideas would not have had a basis. Explorers would not have had maps, and modern law would not have had a baseline. Monasteries as sources of information. Monasteries were the closest thing to publishing houses. Every abbey had its own library, a lector or librarian to oversee reading hours, and a scriptorium for copying books. Although they weren't necessarily monks, scribes' days were organized by monastic life, intermittent prayers, silent meals, working long hours in cold rooms, at desks. Minimal dialogue, focus, humility, and obedience are emphasized. Scribes did not become well known, they completed pages, and there was a sort of silent worship praising the sacred, with accuracy in every letter written and every book copied. Creativity in moderation, despite their propensity for copying. Scribes were not without originality. As a matter of fact, they had to continually innovate, particularly when texts were ambiguous or materials were limited. They created space-saving abbreviations, glosses, notes, help clarify challenging sections, systems of layout for rulings, margins and columns, techniques for indexing complicated texts, punctuation rules, many of which influenced contemporary usage. They worked together as well. One manuscript could include: one scribe will oversee and create the pages, a third to include titles, footnotes, or rubrics, a third to copy the text, a fourth to add illustrations or illumination. Even the bindings, which were occasionally created in-house, were stitched by hand and reinforced with leather, bone, or wood. Even though they worked slowly, scribes helped written communication advance. They contributed to the organization and reading of knowledge, in addition to preserving it. Errors that modified history. Scribes were not perfect either, and occasionally those errors altered everything. For instance, centuries of misconceptions regarding the function of the liver and heart were caused by a mistranslation of a Latin term in a medical literature. The dissemination of mathematical ideas throughout Europe was slowed down by misunderstandings between Greek and Arabic terminology. Conflicting inheritance rules between adjacent territories resulted from scribal miscopying of legal texts. Theological connotations were subtly but permanently altered by biblical copyists who were uncertain how to deal with ambiguous pronouns. The majority of the mistakes were small. However, accumulated distortions impacted society, science, and ideology across decades. Nevertheless, despite their flaws, these texts were preferable to silence. The end of scribes and the printing press. Everything changed by the middle of the 15th century thanks to a German goldsmith by the name of Johannes Gutenberg. His creation, the movable type printing press, was more efficient, less expensive, and more consistent than any human scribe at reproducing books. Scribes first carried on with their task, not entirely trusting the new technology. Some monks even made hand copies of printed literature. However, scriptoria had closed all over Europe by the early 1500s. Scribes either went on to pursue other careers or vanished off the face of the earth. A few manuscripts were recycled or thrown away. Fortunately, others were saved from person to person, shelf to shelf, until they ended up in private collections, museums, or libraries. Many are still being researched today, and the scribes are still in their pages. Every page has a human touch. Scholars may still frequently identify particular scribes by their handwriting nowadays. These peculiarities create a sort of signature, a tall F, a wide G, and a flourish on the R. Colophons are short, frequently signed inscriptions at the end of texts that can be humorous or moving. In the year of grace, 1284, on the feast of St. Jerome, Brother Thomas completed it. My hand hurts. If you learn anything from this book, please pray for me, the copyist. Others only have neatly written lines that stop in the middle of a sentence. Have purpose. We read with ease, remembering the forgotten today. Pages print on demand, typefaces shift, displays illuminate. However, a forgotten heritage, 1,000 ink-stained hands that copied so we might read, lies behind this convenience. They weren't well known. They were not wealthy. They were worn out, cold, and frequently undetectable. However, they handed us the past. We conclude our tale with the following closing words. Written in a 14th century psalter by an unidentified scribe with unsteady ink, rather than by a well-known author. May this writing endure, even if I do not. And it did, and it did. It is before dawn. The village is still. Smoke has not yet risen from the hearths. Chickens murmur softly in their roosts. And then a single, clear clang. It echoes across the thatched rooftops, bounces down the muddy lane, and slips into cottages through shutters and cracks. The bell is calling. It calls the monks to prayer. It rouses the reeve from bed. It signals the beginning of a new day. There are no clocks in the town square, no ticking in bedrooms, no wristwatches or smartphone alarms. Here, in this pre-mechanical world, time is a sound you listen for. This is the world of bell time where your day is not told but rung. The first timekeepers, monastic bells, long before the average villager could tell the hour. Monks were already keeping time. In monasteries across medieval Europe, bells marked the canonical hours, fixed points in the day for prayer and devotion. These weren't optional. They were the spine of monastic life, dividing the day into 7, sometimes 8 parts, including matins around midnight or very early morning lauds before sunrise prime, about 6 a.m. terce, sext, and none. Mid-morning to mid-afternoon vespers, evening compline. Before sleep, each hour began with a bell, rung by the sacristan or bell-ringer. These bells told the monks when to rise, when to eat, when to chant, and when to work in silence. But over time, their sound spread beyond the cloister walls. Bells and the village rhythm. In towns and rural villages, church bells became the default. Public timekeepers. The bell didn't just tell you it was time to pray. It told you when to open the market, when to stop plowing the fields, when curfew began, when someone had died, when a fire was spotted, when a lord was arriving, when the sun was setting. In some places, the ringing of terce about 9 a.m. marked the start of official town business. Sext noon was the break for midday meal. Vespers signaled the end of labor. This was not precise timing. It didn't divide the day into 60-minute intervals, but it was regular, public, and audible, a system of social coordination in a world without personal clocks, and it worked. A blacksmith didn't need to check his sundial. He simply listened. How bells were made and heard. Medieval bells were large, hand-cast bronze instruments, carefully tuned and often named like people. The process of making a bell was laborious. A mold was created from clay and wax. Molten bronzan alloy of copper and tin was poured into it. Once cooled, the bell was tuned by filing or cutting the inner walls to produce the right note. The bell was then blessed and hoisted into the tower. The size of the bell determined how far it could be heard. A large bell might carry 2 to 3 miles, depending on wind and terrain. Small village bells were more modest, but still loud enough to reach farmhands in the fields. For villagers, the bell was a kind of auditory clock tower. The sound was woven into the landscape. When you hear the third bell, come to the green. Wait until the Vespers bell before lighting torches. The Angelus bell means supper. Bell codes and what they meant, different bell patterns, meant different things. A single, slow toll equals death. 3 quick peals equals wedding. A short, sharp ring equals market opening. 9 consecutive rings equals call to council or justice. Bell rung in reverse direction. Backward pull equals emergency. Often fire in some towns. There was even a bellringer's manual, a set of local rules that dictated how and when to ring for various events. Certain bells were named for their roles: the curfew bell, the sanctus bell, the work bell, the fire bell, the harvest bell. Over time, ringing itself became a skilled profession. A village bellringer needed to know how to maintain the mechanism, keep the rope properly coiled, ring the correct pattern for feast days, fasts, or funerals, wake early, and ring accurately in darkness or bad weather. It was a respected, if humble, job. The bell and the body clock. What's remarkable is how attuned people became to the bell's rhythm. Without clocks, most villagers developed an internal sense of time based on routine and natural light, reinforced by the bell's reminders. They knew the angle of sun at lauds, the stomach's pangs at sext, the cooling air at vespers, the shadow length at none. The bell was not intrusive. It was part of how people understood their place in the daon, by extension, their place in the world. Unlike modern timekeeping, which slices the day into strict, unbending segments, bell time was relational. It flexed with seasons. It followed light and labor. It allowed for slowness and sameness. One historian called it the acoustic map of the medieval day. The church, as timekeeper, the church didn't just ring the hours, it owned them. Time itself, in medieval Europe, was considered sacred property. The church dictated when to fast, when to feast, when to sleep, and when to work less or not at all. Holy days, saints' days, liturgical seasons, all were marked by bells and rituals. This gave the clergy tremendous influence. In many towns, disputes about bell ringing, who rang it, how often, and for what reason, became deeply political. Lords argued with abbots. Merchants petitioned for extra bells to ring on market days. Peasants sometimes refused to obey a curfew bell, especially during harvest. But despite these tensions, the centrality of the bell never wavered. Even in cities as large as Paris or London, most people still oriented their day by sound, not sight. So we close this first section as the evening bell tolls. Imagine it, low, echoing, deliberate. It bounces off stone walls and seeps into cottages, reminding every ear that the day is done. There is no written clock, but the bell has told you. The bells have rung prime. The day has begun. In the field, a man sets down his plow to wipe his brow. He doesn't need to look at a watch. He listens. The bell from the chapel tower has sounded its third peal of the morning. That means he has about an hour until sex time for bread and ale. In the village square, children pause their game when the mid-morning bell rings. A woman finishes sweeping her doorstep. A blacksmith listens for the bell to signal the meal break, which will also bring his apprentice back from delivering tools. In the medieval world, timekeeping was a shared experience. There were no ticking clocks in the corner of the room. Time was communal, not personal, and bells were its trusted messenger. Time in the absence of machines, before mechanical clocks were widespread. Roughly before the late 13th century, the majority of people had no precise way of measuring time beyond the position of the sun, the movement of shadows, the rhythm of routine tasks, and most dependably, the church bell. Even sundials, though present in monasteries and some manor houses, were of limited use due to cloud cover, seasonal light changes, and general inaccessibility to the rural poor. Yet life continued, with remarkable structure. Peasants rose with first light, broke their fast at sext, and ceased work at vespers. Craftsmen timed labor to bell intervals. Women baked, brewed, spun, and washed according to ringing patterns. Even criminals knew their fate by the sound. Executions were scheduled to coincide with bell-marked hours. This created a culture where time was auditory, not visual, shared, not private, flexible, but not unstructured. Time was not owned by the individual, it was announced by the bell and belonged to the community. Curfew bells and the night clock, one of the most widely recognized bell events in medieval towns, was the curfew bell. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, literally cover fire. When the curfew bell rang, usually at sunset or shortly after, it signaled that hearth fires should be damped, candles extinguished, and people should retire indoors. This wasn't just a safety measure, it was also a form of social regulation. Inns closed, market stalls shuttered, public gatherings ended, town gates, if present, were barred. Breaking curfew could result in fines, arrest, or worse, if someone was found outdoors without cause. In some towns, the bell was rung again at midnight, a rare sound that marked matins in monasteries, or signaled danger, fire, or an emergency meeting. People listened. The absence of timepieces meant the bell's role was authoritative. It was the only thing that told you when to begin, to stop, or to beware. Work, worship, and waiting. For many professions, bell time wasn't just a guide, it was a schedule. Craftsmen and merchants, artisans, opened shops after prime and closed at vespers. Markets might begin after lauds and pause at sext. A bell might even announce midday prayers in the guild hall, during which all work ceased. Farmers, rural laborers worked from first light until the vespers bell, with short breaks at terce and sext. The bell gave structure to plowing, sowing, and harvesting, aligning human labor with both season and sunlight. Marriage, baptism, death, special bells marked life events. A wedding bell would ring with celebratory patterns. A baptism might be announced with 3 peals. Repeated, a death knell would toll slowly, often once for each year of the deceased's age. These rhythms of joy and mourning were known to all. You didn't need to see the body, you just heard the ring. Bell politics, who controlled the hours. Though bells marked time for everyone, they were usually owned by the church, and their use was closely guarded. In some towns, conflicts arose over who had the right to ring the bell. The monastery might control the bell tower, but the mayor wanted it used for town meetings. A merchant guild might want their own bell to summon members. Lay people occasionally petitioned to have new bells added for faster warnings or greater independence. In 13th century York, there was a dispute between the abbey and town council over the timing of market bells, leading to multiple excommunications and even brief riots. In many places, only clergy or designated bell ringers were allowed to touch the ropes. It was both a technical task and a sacred responsibility. To misuse the bell was seen as disruptive and sinful. And yet, as the bell became essential to civic life, secular authorities slowly demanded control over time itself. From ringing to regulation, as urban centers grew, bells began ringing not just for spiritual matters, but also for commerce and law. Towns instituted regulated bell schedules for court sessions, toll collection, or public announcements. Some cities used bells to announce opening and closing of gates, arrival of ships, or even execution times. Special bell tones developed to distinguish religious from civic events. In Paris, the bell of the Palais de Justice announced important royal decisions. In Florence, the Tordella Vacca Tower of the Cow rang to call public meetings. In England, the common bell summoned guildsmen to council. Thus, bells evolved from monastic timekeepers into symbols of urban governance. By the 14th century, some towns even began installing mechanical clock faces, often on churches or towers. But the bell remained the primary time signal. People might glance at the new dials, but they still waited to hear the ring. Living by the bell, the bell wasn't always peaceful. Bells meant you were never quite in charge of your own schedule. Your labor was measured. Even if you couldn't measure it yourself, your moments of rest, reflection, or interruption were chosen for you still. For most people, bells offered a kind of dependable certainty. The bell was never late. It had no favorites. It spoke to all, rich and poor, literate and not. It did not hurry or delay, simply rang. In a time when life was short, labor was long, and calendars were complicated, the bell was a simple answer to a complicated question. What time is it? So we end this section with a village listening once more. The bell rings again maybe. Vespers, maybe Compline. The animals quiet. Lamps are lit. The day winds down. Tomorrow it will ring again, and the village will rise. But what happens when a bell doesn't ring? When sound is silenced, or controlled, or lost? It's the mid-14th century. A mechanical clock doesn't chime just at prime or vespers. It strikes every hour, exactly, regardless of light, season, or ecclesiastical rhythm. For the first time in centuries, the bell is no longer the master of time. The change has begun. Its first mechanical timekeepers, the first known mechanical clocks in Europe, appeared in the late 13th century. Unlike sundials or water clocks, they used weights, gears, and escapement mechanisms to measure time independently of sunlight. These early clocks were large, public installations, placed on towers or churches, not for private use, but for communal observation. Among the earliest examples, 1283, a large clock installed in Dunstable Priory, England, 1300. A clock with hourly chimes appears in Milan, c. 1330. Salisbury Cathedral adds a striking mechanism, one of the oldest still surviving. These clocks did not yet have minute or second hands. Their main purpose was to chime to ring bells automatically on the hour. This meant bells could now mark time with mechanical precision, not human estimation. It was revolutionary. Time becomes regular, not relational, with clocks now striking. Every hour, a fundamental shift occurred. Instead of responding to natural cues, light, hunger, fatigue, people began responding to measured intervals. Time became uniform, the same number of hours in winter and summer. It became fragmented, divided into minutes and eventually seconds. It became visible, not just audible. This change had profound consequences. In monasteries, the new clocks disrupted the rhythm of prayer. Some abbots resisted mechanical clocks, fearing they would replace spiritual attentiveness with blind routine. In cities, merchants saw the potential. Meetings could start on time. Markets could open with precision. Labor could be measured in fixed hours, not vague parts of the day. For the first time, productivity could be timed and, eventually, regulated. The bell still rang, but it now rang on behalf of the machine, not the monk. Bells as symbols of authority. As mechanical clocks proliferated, bells began to take on symbolic roles, not just functional ones. In Venice, the Torre dell'Orologio became both a timekeeper and a monument to civic order. In Prague, the astronomical clock was not just a bell, it was a display of technological power and cosmic harmony. In Paris, the great bell of Notre Dame still rang, but now it rang with political intent as often as with religious purpose. Bells continued to announce royal births and deaths, city assemblies and public hangings, wars begun and treaties signed, but no longer did they control the hours that belonged now to the clock face, a quiet circle that ticked relentlessly, even in silence. Resistance and nostalgia. Not everyone welcomed this transformation. Some clergy warned that mechanical timekeeping would erode spiritual attentiveness, people to obey machines rather than God. Peasants, especially in rural areas, continued to rely on natural time and bell time well into the 16th century. There were also technical problems. Early clocks often drifted, requiring constant maintenance. Their dials were often unreadable in poor light, making the bell still essential after dark. For a time, both systems coexisted. Bells for the poor, the illiterate, the rural clocks for the urban, the educated, the elite, but the direction was clear. As portable watches appeared in the 16th century, time would no longer be a shared public sound. It would be a private possession, something one carried in a pocket or strapped to the wrist. The bell's afterlife, despite its decline as a timekeeper, the bell never disappeared. In fact, bells took on new roles. Parades and proclamations. University bells tolled to mark academic hours, war memorials added bells to chime in remembrance. In many places, the bell became a symbol of community memory, not regulation. It no longer ruled the day, but it still called people together. And in villages where clocks were too expensive or unreliable, bell towers remained the only public timepiece well into the 18th century. Even today, in cities across Europe, church bells still ring the hours, though few people actually use them to tell time. From sound to sight, what was lost? When time moved from bell to clock, something intangible was lost. Bell time was immersive. You didn't look at it, you lived in it. It surrounded you like weather. It arrived as sound, shared by everyone within earshot. Mechanical time is objective, measurable, isolating. It's on your wrist, your phone, your wall. You must check it rather than hear it. You relate to it, not through sound or rhythm, but through countdown, appointment, and delay. Bell time followed, the contours of life. Clock time shapes it from outside. Some modern thinkers have called this the transition from natural time to industrial time. Others simply say we went from living in time to living by the clock. Echoes of the bell, and yet, even now, we still crave the bell. In old towns, bells chime out of habit, a kind of sonic heritage in digital clocks. We mimic the bell chime in our alarms, school bells, factory buzzer, train whistles, all descendants of that ancient toll. Even notifications on phones mimic the short tones of miniature bells. We haven't let the bell go. We've just shrunk it, digitized it, and placed it in our pockets. But deep inside, there's something ancient that still responds to a distant chime, something that remembers when the day was announced, not scheduled. When life moved not in minutes, but in moments between rings. And so we end this story, not with a ticking clock, but with the slow toll of an old bell fading into dusk. Bong, 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 bongs. Not to tell us the hour exactly, but to remind us that time once had a voice, and for centuries we listened.